Hi, my name is Andrea Goyen, and I am the Environmental Literacy and Sustainability Coordinator at the San Mateo County Office of Education. In this video, I'm going to provide an overview to how to introduce climate action and climate mitigation to students. And in general, this is best for upper elementary, secondary, or adult students. But of course, you can totally introduce solutionary thinking to younger students. It's just that the content in here is going to be more for older students. So I'm going to share my screen and walk you through it. Okay, so as always, if you've been with us for the first couple of videos, then you'll know that we've done some buildup where we've introduced climate change, we've talked about the climate crisis and the impacts, and now we're to the point where we are looking at climate mitigation and climate action. So you can find more of those resources here at the link, tinyurl.com/smcoe-climate-ed. So just to go back a little bit, it's important that students understand that there's two human crises that we are dealing with: ecological overshoot and global warming and climate change. This video is going to primarily focus on global warming and climate change. However, there's a lot of solutionary thinking that needs to be done for ecological overshoot as well. Of course, having students understand the basic introduction to climate change is important. So thinking through habitat destruction and ecosystem degradation as like the ecological overshoot part, and then how climate change is this greatest symptom of that. So that's important. Students and adults need to know the climate change fundamentals. So again, that was like the basics, and here's a little bit more on it. So showing natural greenhouse effect compared to human enhanced greenhouse effect, and then those impacts. And again, there's another separate video and resources on all that. And then there's also another separate video and resources on going way more in depth on these impacts of climate change. And partly that's to build their sense of urgency because we're in a crisis, right? So the report that was released by the IPCC in 2018 lets us know that we're in a major crisis. We began a shift from anticipating to understanding we're in it. And we know now that if we take little action, little or no action, we are going to be experiencing widespread chaos by 2050. So those are the projections. So the point of this exercise is to say kids should be there now. They should be at this heightened sense of urgency. And now it's like, let's dive into the hopeful part of all this. So climate action. So I'm going to give the short version to understanding global and local action for climate mitigation. And then I'll point you to resources if you want to do a longer version with your students. So very important to understand the climate crisis requires two pathways forward. One is mitigation and one is adaptation. There will be a separate set of resources that really focus on adaptation. This one is going to focus on efforts to reduce or prevent emissions of heat trapping gases. Yes, we are at the point where it's all hands on deck time. So solutionary thinking at all levels, at all scales, local, global, everything. And of course, the climate crisis really demands a paradigm shift. So in this segment and in some of the activities that will be previewed here, we highly recommend that students are thinking about the different levers for change, like policy change, cultural mindset change, and behavior change. So if they're going to be doing some solutionary action, we want to help them think about how can you do at least one of these, if not a combination of multiple ones. So starting really at the policy level, let's look at the paradigm shifting that's happening at different scales in our government. So the United Nations and the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which began in 1995, has had a long journey of getting together and trying to come to some sort of legally binding universal agreement. That happened with the Paris Agreement in 2015. So there's a legally binding universal agreement now on mitigating climate change. And of course, there's a lot of controversy around it, but in the last 2 years, really, we've seen this take hold, and we've seen the mechanisms embedded into this framework actually working. Also in California, there's a lot of leadership around climate change. So California has been doing this for at least 2006 and has really been part of the top 3 priorities for California in the past few years. And really, California has been seen as a policy leader on climate change. There's a lot of things happening though at the local level as well. So at the global scale, you'll see C40 cities are cities where there's mayors or leaders who are committed to policy and behavior change action. And then over here on this one, you'll see that there's states and cities who've also stepped up to say we commit at the local level to the Paris Agreement. So we've got the United States Climate Alliance and the Mayor's National Climate Agenda. Also at the San Mateo County local scale, our County Board of Supervisors declared a climate emergency in 2019 and have moved a lot of resources towards figuring out how to mitigate climate change. And the Youth Commission also declared a climate emergency in April 2020. We've seen in our San Mateo cities and towns as well, climate commitment. Actually, we're seen as leaders in the world in San Mateo County for having so much local commitment to mitigating climate change. So every single one of these has some sort of climate action plan happening. Also, just a very quick highlight, we have young local elected leaders who are putting climate change in their top priorities. So that's very exciting as well. So as you can see, we've got a lot happening. I saved the United States government till the very end because it's been a bit since we've had a commitment at the federal government to deal with climate change. But President Biden came in 2020, has said mitigating and adapting to climate change is in the top 4 priorities for his administration, and very quickly and very swiftly has committed to that and shown that he's standing by that. So we've seen a lot of policy shifts happen in the first couple months of his presidency to really stand by his word that we're going to take action and take it now. So there's a lot of hope. I think it's also important to say, yes, there's all this policy and legally binding things at the United Nations scale, the federal scale, the state scale, the local scale, but also just this broader movement of a global paradigm shift. So the United Nations has declared this the decade of actions. The 2020s are the decade of action where we absolutely need to make a shift. Otherwise, we are at great, great danger as humanity. So it's good that they framed this broader thing as, yes, climate change is part of it, but there's so many other pieces to it. I think it's also really relevant to note here that climate advocacy has simply exploded in the last 3 years. Of course, pretty much everybody's familiar now with Greta Thunberg as one of the leaders of the youth climate movement. But it's not just youth, right? There's also many, many adults joining in this fight and in this battle. And this has been going on for a number of years with massive marches happening globally. So the climate movement is absolutely critical for making a tipping point of change in our governmental policies, and that's why we're seeing that change at the international, national, state, local level. And I think it's also important to note here that there's leadership going on in business and higher ed. So we've seen a pretty significant shift in the business community to getting on board with environmental sustainability and climate action. So there's a number of different groups laid out here. Triple bottom line accounting is a way to really show this in your accounting and in your bottom line. So looking at your profits and making sure that you're accounting for environmental impact and social impact. There's certified green businesses that are showing this through their behavior, that they are making changes and commitments. And then the We Mean Business Coalition are businesses that have committed to mitigating climate change in their operations and being a part of the Paris Agreement in that way. And then we're seeing this across higher education as well. So this is happening at universities all over the world, all over the United States, but I'm going to highlight here that the University of California and the CSU system as well have all made major commitments to sustainability and have this in their top 3 to 5 priorities of what they're doing in their facilities, but also in their curriculum. And then lastly, I mentioned the decade of action, but there's so many global campaigns now for action. And these are campaigns that are just like, let's get everybody inspired, let's get everybody motivated. And then there's also campaigns that are really connected to money and prizes. So the Earthshot Prize has been started in the UK, and that's really focused around getting solutions for sustainability and climate change. Elon Musk is offering a $100 million prize for carbon capture technology. The Bezos Earth Fund is another large prize, financial prize for people who can think through how to do environmental sustainability and climate change and bring forward a really important solution. And then, like I said, over here on the left, we've got more of these that are just like getting massive amounts of people to commit and change their behaviors or change policy, or just say, I have a mindset shift that I've bought into. So there's a lot of different things happening. And students you can obviously talk about that stuff with students, or you can have them explore this in a web quest form. So in this web quest, if you go down to section 3 and 4, you will see that there are a number of different resources. You got to get past problem 2, which has all the bad things and the scary stuff, but get down to number 3 here, and you'll see that there's a segment on public opinion shifting on climate change. So I mentioned that the climate movement has really launched a shift here. And in fact, we now show that nearly 60% of Americans are alarmed or very concerned about climate change, and really similar data on how Americans see the environment and the need to act on the environment. And there's a lot of relevant data here on schools too. But the fourth section is on climate action. And this is where students can actually explore and go deeper into some of those examples that were shared here. In particular, the Paris Agreement is an important one for students to understand, probably more of a secondary students and adults, but it can be definitely explained to younger students as well. And then there's stuff here around the United Nations development goals, around Biden's commitments, around what's going on in the Green New Deal, because that's been such a common topic to be discussed in terms of how is this connected to jobs and environmental justice. And then there's other issues like going on in California. And then if you're in San Mateo County, of course, there's resources here to better understand what's happening there. And then also some of the other things that were mentioned, like business and higher ed. And also the faith communities. I didn't go in depth at all about that here, but there's a lot happening in the faith communities as well. So that is another way to get at some of the content with students. I think it's really important at that point to pause and do some reflecting around emotions and emotional reaction. Hopefully your students are feeling hopeful at that point about the future, but they might have a lot of questions as well. So giving them a chance to just pause and think that through. Now, it might be good to do a trauma-informed practices. We've been saying to do it all along, especially with the things that are like crisis-based, but it's equally important to do it on things that are hopeful. So giving students that same chance to sit with nature, do some journaling, do some activities, meditations that really allow them to see this as a trauma-informed practice that carries all the way from sense of urgency and crisis to hope. And that's how we sustain ourselves, is by doing things that are healthy. There is a long version to this. So if you want to go way more in depth on that history and on some of the actions that are happening, the slides here, there's tons of slides here to think about the different phases of environmental concern. So it takes you from like the early or the mid 20th century all the way up. So looking at what was going on in the 1960s to 1995. So some things like, Earth Day, thinking about when the definition of sustainability came into place, jumping ahead to 1995. That's when the Conference of Parties and the United Nations Convention on Climate Change began. So then it goes through a bunch of the different Conference of Parties and the ones that were successful and the ones that were not successful in some of that history. And then getting up to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I mentioned religion a bit back, and that's because the Catholic Church in particular played such a key role around 2015 in getting more climate advocacy around the world. And then some more details about slides or about trends and patterns that you've already seen. It also addresses the issue around the Trump administration and how the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement actually spurred on solutionary action in many local places. So in some ways that kind of accelerated some of the commitments, but it was really, really critical that we got to the point where we are today, where we have a new administration that is not just happening at the local level, but is that federal commitment as well. So that's all the different resources to go a bit more in depth if you have a lengthier time with students and really want to have them dig into the history. Now, the last thing that I want to show here is just a couple of different activities that can be done with students. So one is an experiential climate action and mitigation activity where they actually get to do like a role play simulation. So there's a tool that's been developed by, I believe it's by MIT. It's called En-ROADS. And this tool is, MIT Sloan Sustainability Initiative. So the basics of this tool is it gives students a chance to be those global politicians who show up to a climate conference and try to figure out how to keep our global temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So they get to actually play around with like, well, what would it look like if we totally got rid of coal? Like if we said, let's highly tax it, let's get rid of it. What would it look like if we completely subsidized renewables? What would it look like if we got rid of natural gas, got rid of oil? What would it look like if we said, okay, nuclear is all right, we'll do a little bit with that? What would it look like if we got more energy efficient in our transportation and if we incentivize electrification? Then they have to think about other things like deforestation, like how can we make sure that we reduce deforestation? So they will play around with it and they'll have conversations around how difficult is it to really get down to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And it is very difficult. So they'll play around with it. Good to work with a partner on something like that, and then have them debrief it. What was challenging? What was exciting? What were barriers and opportunities? You could do this in a very short time period. I've done this with students in just like a 10 to 15 minute activity, or you can make this a couple days or a week where kids are really into the simulation. So that's there for you. There's also one more that is a little bit more connected to like the social studies mindset. And that's looking at how there is hope for change based on what we've been able to do historically. So this one is looking at these levers for change and is connecting back to where in history have we seen change happen. So for example, we saw large scale mobilization in World War II, where humans were able to just rapidly mobilize in 6 months. And it took us a little more than 3.5 years to get to victory in the war. Also, other policy that has been successful in the global world, with the Montreal Protocol being signed in 1987, having universal ratification, and something like behavior change around anti-smoking. So helping our students understand that change is possible at the policy level, the cultural level, at the behavior change and mass mobilization level. And then connecting that to something like a tool like Drawdown, where they're actually going to look at all the different possible solutions to climate change. And Drawdown, if you're unfamiliar with it, it's the idea that we need to draw down our emissions, and that there's a moment of drawdown, and then from there, everything goes down. And so how do we achieve this? Well, there's a ton of different solutions out there in all these different sectors or different areas of focus. So looking at sources of greenhouse gas emissions, looking at sinks, and really trying to figure out like, how do we put a bunch of solutions together to really tackle this and bring us down to 1.5, bring us to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming. So that's a really fun project for students. I think you can do this about secondary up. If you want to use it with upper elementary, you really need to like make the reading a little bit more simplified for them before they can really tackle it, because it's definitely at a secondary reading level. But have students select 1 to 2 solutions from Drawdown, think about what's feasible, think about what they could scale up, determine what might be the levers of change that they would use and where are they using it. And then go back to history and say like, okay, well, I think this historical example would be a great example to pair with this Drawdown solution to show that we could do this. So those are all the different possible activities that I recommend. Those are some of the content slides that I recommend to take students through. You can find more resources here at this link.